Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Helga Ulrich, Curator of European Art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you a new and very distinguished colleague, Anne Dumas, who comes to us from the Royal Academy in London, with whom we shall share her for the next years. Anne did her studies and wrote her dissertation at the Courtauld Institute in London, writing on the personal collection of Edgar Degas. She has worked repeatedly with our director Gary Tintereau when he was a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, putting together exhibitions like the private collection of Edgar Degas and the wonderful and engaging exhibition on Matisse, The Fabric of Dreams, his art and his textiles, as well as Cézanne to Picasso, Ambroise Vollard, the patron of avant-garde. In her stewardship at the Royal Academy since 1999, she has mounted exhibitions on Van Gogh, The Artist and His Letters in 2010, Matisse and the Studio in 2017, and co-curated from Russia, French and Russian master paintings from 1870 to 1925 from Moscow and St. Petersburg. Painting the Modern Garden, Monet and Matisse in 2016, Revolution, Russian art from 1917 to 1932 in 2017. For her efforts, she has been awarded the MBE, the Member of the Order of the British Empire, for her services to the arts, and we are very honored to be able to have her here with us as consulting curator for the upcoming future. Please give a very warm, big Houston welcome to Anne Dumas. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. I'd just like to start by saying how incredibly happy I am to be here in Houston. I can honestly say it's the most hospitable city I've ever been to. Everybody's so warm and open and kind and friendly. I feel as if I've spent my whole life here, and I've only been here for 2.5 weeks. So. I'm also very happy to have the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon about this very special exhibition, Monet to Picasso, a very private collection. And I would like to begin by thanking our sponsors, the Kinder Foundation, the Rand Group, as well as Carol and Mike Lynn, Anne Trammell, and Houston Public Media. Without their support, the members and patrons of the museum, and of course all of you, it would not be possible to realize these great exhibitions. Monet to Picasso is the exhibition of a very private collection, put together by a couple in the last decades of the 20th century, whose passion really was mostly for modern French art of the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. Certainly one of the most remarkable periods in the history of European painting, and one of the most significant in the history of modern art, when the foundations for all of the exciting developments in the 20th and now 21st centuries were laid. Most of the artists will be familiar to you: Monet, Pissarro, Cézanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin in the 19th century, and the two great giants of the 20th century, Matisse and Picasso. And you may even have seen one or two of these paintings from this collection from time to time in different exhibitions, as individual works from the collection have been lent. But what makes this exhibition so special, that never before has the entire collection been shown in a public institution. Not only does it include great works by the leading artists of the time at the height of their careers, but it covers all the major movements that define this dynamic period, from Impressionism to Cubism and beyond. Just to mention before I begin to show you the images, I'm going to show a broad selection of works in the exhibition, but in order to provide a context and revealing comparisons, I will also be showing other works of art, and some of which are in this museum's own collection. So the first slide then, by Alfred Sisley, from about 1880, is, I would say, the sort of typical Impressionist painting, and a very fine example of it. It's a view along the River Seine at Maurice-sur-Loing, a rather rural place where Sisley settled for quite a long time. It's bathed in a summer light. The whole painting is just full of luminosity. And you can see that the textures of the grass in the foreground are built up of a lot of sort of small, separate brushstrokes, as is the foliage in the trees above, these very light, fluffy clouds, and the reflections in the water. So this is a painting I think really defines the Impressionist style, technique, and subject matter. Also early in the exhibition, you will see this painting from quite early in the career of Paul Cézanne, who went on to be one of the great landscape painters of the 19th and very early 20th century. Rather different from the Sisley, it has a sort of feeling of firmness and solidity about it. And if you look closely at the actual work in the exhibition, you will see that he is also using this sort of small, broken Impressionist brushwork, but he builds up a very firm and solid surface. And indeed, the road leads our eye into the distance with that patch of sunlight catching it just as it turns the bend. But the shapes of the hillside, the countryside, and the houses form a kind of overall interlocking pattern. This represented a huge step forward for Cézanne in his career because he was quite an isolated, a bit of a loner throughout his whole life. He came from Aix-en-Provence in the south of France and came to Paris in the early 1870s to align himself with what was the new movements, the avant-garde in the capital. But when I show you how he was painting before he came to Paris, you can see what a huge difference his contact with the Impressionists made to him. In the 1860s, as a young artist living with his family in Aix, most of his subjects were drawn from his rather torrid imagination. And he often painted these dark, quite violent subjects, scenes of rape, and here we have the murder of 1868. But on arriving in Paris, he would hang out in the cafes in the Place Pigalle, just south of Montmartre, where all of the emerging group of Impressionist artists would meet and talk about their new ideas and this new exciting way of painting that they were developing. And one of the most important figures was a leader of the Impressionist group, Camille Pissarro, and I show you a landscape by him on the right. And I think you can see how Cézanne has been influenced by him. Pissarro took Cézanne out into the countryside. We don't know the exact place where Cézanne's landscape was painted, but it's somewhere in the countryside, probably not so far from Paris. But Pissarro taught Cézanne to escape from his inner thoughts, his rather feverish, dark imagination, and look out around him at nature, at the countryside, and above all at light, air, and atmosphere. Pissarro was a very appealing figure, somebody I think I would like to have known. He was about a decade older than most of the other Impressionists and really acted as a sort of father figure and a mentor to many of them. He had a very large family. He was never really made nearly as much money as some of the other Impressionists like Monet and so on did later in their careers. But he was very kind, extremely generous spirit, and really encouraged and helped a lot of the younger Impressionists. I'm going to very quickly sketch in the story of the kind of early development of Impressionism. It's a well-known story, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with, but it is very relevant, I think, to the works that we see in this collection. So around 1869, we find Renoir and Monet painting together at this sort of a leisure spot along the Seine. It was called La Grenouillère, Grenouille, as you probably know, is frog in French, so this meant either the frog pond or this little round island. It was sometimes known as the Camembert because of its round shape. But it was where ordinary Parisian people would go on a sunny Sunday afternoon, say, and, you know, there was a little restaurant, a little cafe there, and to go boating. And Cézanne and Renoir and Monet have set up their easels side by side and have captured this very lively scene in these very small, kind of quite lively, vigorous brushwork. And so why, we wonder, why was this kind of art considered shocking at the time? Because it certainly isn't shocking today. Everybody loves Impressionism, and I think it's very difficult to recapture at this distance how this was ever considered difficult art. But we have to remember that what was acceptable at the Salon was much more elevated subject, scenes from history, religion, or mythology, not everyday, ordinary life, and also rather meticulously, carefully painted, often with a sort of darker background, you know, using techniques still going back to the old masters. So this kind of painting just seemed very sort of rough and ready, and by artists who weren't really masters of their skill. This is the painting that gave Impressionism its name. Monet's Impression Sunrise of 1872, that was painted looking out over the harbour at Le Havre on the Normandy coast, which is where Monet grew up, seeing the sun come up over the boats and even sort of factory chimneys, early signs of industrialization. But what he's really interested in here is the reflection of the sunlight on the water, the rippling patterns on the water. And this was shown at the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. This was a fringe group of artists, really outside of the mainstream. They had to borrow a friend, a photographer's studio in order to put on their exhibition. There's no way they would have been accepted at this stage at the official salon. And a hostile critic who sort of said, you know, well, this artist hasn't any training at all. He's not really an artist. He's just a bodger, a dauber, said it's not really a painting. It's just an impression. And my goodness, has that name stuck. But we're very pleased here to have, as you know, in parallel with this private collection exhibition, there's a very beautiful exhibition of the work of one of the only two women Impressionist artists, Berthe Morisot. And here is a painting by her that was also in that first Impressionist exhibition and was also criticized for its lack of finish, its very loose brushwork. And actually, one of the defining characteristics of Morisot as an artist is that she really pushed this loose, fresh, spontaneous style very far, as I think you can see looking at this kind of brushwork. So these artists, they place great value at painting outdoors on the spot, capturing the spontaneity of the moment. Of course, artists had always painted outside, you know, from the 17th century, probably before. You get landscape artists sketching out of doors. But the difference between what they were doing and what the Impressionists did is that they would not consider their sketches as having the status of a finished exhibitable work of art. It would just be a preparatory study. Whereas for the Impressionists, getting down on canvas, that immediate spontaneous reaction to what they were looking at was the essence of what they were trying to do. And just by comparison, I show you a work by a very important and famous artist of the time, painted just at the same time as Monet and Renoir were painting the Grenouille subjects we saw a moment ago. This is a painting in the Museum of Fine Arts Houston collection, just to show you that this is the sort of style, this absolutely flawless technique with, you know, no visible brush strokes, very clear outlines, that was still the sort of establishment against which the Impressionists were kicking. Bouguereau was, you know, vastly more successful and famous and wealthy, at least at this date, than the Impressionists were. Here's a painting by Pissarro, quite a bit later, 1897, It's of his garden at a place called Éragny, about 20 miles or so outside of Paris, where he lived with his large family. On the whole, he couldn't really afford to live in Paris. It's a lovely garden though, in late summer, full of late summer flowers, and we just see the rooftop beyond the garden wall of a house known locally as the deaf woman's house that Pissarro did paint in another painting. But this is only 6 years before Pissarro's death in 1903, but I think it's interesting to see that his style had gone through different changes, but at the end of his career and his life, he comes back to what is essentially an impressionist way of painting. This, however, is very different. This is Monet in 1889, so quite a long time from, that first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, but only 3 years after the last of the Impressionist group exhibitions. By this time, Monet and some of the other Impressionists had felt the need to sort of move beyond their Impressionist discoveries. And in Monet's case, this took the form of more dramatic subject matter. Most of his earlier paintings had been in quite sort of domestic landscapes, often in or around Paris. So he started to travel to different regions of France to seek out more dramatic scenery, and he also begins to paint in a rather different way. This is at the confluence of two rivers, the Creuse and then the Petite Creuse, but the main Creuse is a big, powerful river in the center of France, as you can see, banked on either side by these very steep banks. It's a magnificent painting, I think. I mean, for me, it's one of the great paintings in this collection, because it's so simple. He takes just very few elements, just these great sweeping banks, the water, the higher land, the horizon beyond, and the sky. And if you look closely at this painting, you can see that his brushwork is now very different from his earlier pure Impressionist style. He paints in these sort of long strands, ribbons almost, of interwoven colour. And I think he's caught beautifully the contrast between the left-hand bank, which is very much in the shade, and the way that the sun captures the reds, pinks, oranges, much sort of warmer, richer colours in the sunlit bank to the right. And an especially beautiful passage is the way that he's caught the water sort of sparkling on the river, brighter in the upper part with lots of brilliant turquoises, vivid blues and greens as the sun catches the water, and shading down to more deeper, sonorous, more purple tones at the bottom. Interestingly enough, this is one of 5 paintings that Monet does of this subject. I show you the one in the collection here with 2 other versions here, because what he's really interested in here is not just the subject itself, but above all, the way it changes under different conditions of light and at different times of day. So I think you can see this one is under grey sky. So the central one is the one we have here in the exhibition. And then the other one is a much sort of brighter tonality altogether. And it's just around this time that Monet develops this idea of painting in series of paintings. So he's really moved away from that idea of outdoor spontaneity that was at the root of Impressionism at the beginning. I'm sure that he starts off painting outside in front of the subject, but then he would go back to his studio at his house at Giverny in the north of France, and he would surround himself by several of these landscapes at the same time in easels on a sort of circle around him, and he would go from one to the other, bringing out relationships from one canvas to another, almost like variations on a theme in a piece of music. I just show you quickly another of his famous series 2 paintings from his Haystack series of 1891, and then he went on to do many others, Rouen Cathedral, the bridges over the Thames in London. But this serial idea was very important for him. very original, I think, and these series of exhibitions were originally shown at the Durand Ruel Gallery in Paris, so that the public could understand that they weren't one-off paintings, but they were kind of an interrelated series. And of course, the notion of series has had far-reaching implications into art in the 20th and 21st centuries. A beautiful Renoir, also painted quite a few years after the early years of Impressionism, but still retaining this wonderful lightness of touch of a young girl in a very glamorous white hat with a veil and a feather. He has a marvelous use of transparent paint. And I think it's interesting to remember that as a very young man, before he was really a painter, he was trying to be a painter, Renoir earned his living as a porcelain painter. And if you see here, look at the sleeve of her dress, for example, the way those different colours of a sort of mauvey blue, greens and pinks come through this diaphanous surface of the sleeve. And I thought it was going through the galleries the other day and seeing this beautiful Berthe Morisot lent to the exhibition from the Art Institute of Chicago, a back view of this girl in a white dress or perhaps an undergarment. I think you can see that this sort of light touch and this diaphanous sort of silvery tone links these two artists, at least on this particular occasion. And of course, the Impressionists were quite a close-knit group, and so though they worked in different individual styles, they are constantly looking at each other's works. Of course, the Morisot is painted many years earlier, but it's very likely a painting that Renoir would have known. This is Mary Cassatt. She and Berthe Morisot were really the only two women in the Impressionist group, which was a very remarkable thing for the time. I mean, it was hard to become a woman, a successful artist as a woman, but especially in a sort of avant-garde and originally a sort of fringe group rather than as part of the establishment. Mary Cassatt is an American artist, came from a very well-to-do background in Philadelphia, and she moved to Paris, where she became, through Degas, who was a great friend and admirer of hers, involved with the Impressionists. And rather like Berthe Morisot, her subject is very much domestic life, women and children, partly because, you know, she couldn't go out in the street and put up her easel like a man artist could. She came from a very upper middle class background. She had to conform to the social proprieties of the time. But she brings, I think, tremendous presence to these two works, both of a little boy called Jules, after his bath, the way she sort of outlined him against this, as opposed to him with great presence against this dark background. It reminds us that she was, like many of these artists, although they were part of the avant-garde, also spent a lot of time looking at old master painting in the Louvre. The other painting is much more sketchy in technique, and Mary Cassatt, like Degas, was one of the great artists in pastel in the 19th century, and I think we can see something, this is oil, but you can see something of that kind of almost chalky, loose feeling that you can get with pastel in this work. I just show you here two other works by Cassatt, both in this museum's collection, and a work by Berthe Morisot on view in the current exhibition, just to sort of show the kind of subject matter that Morisot and Cassatt treated, although I think there is a difference in their approach. Gauguin, always associated with the South Seas, with the tropics, although he'd had a rather adventurous early life as a sailor, and then for a while, rather sort of unexpectedly, he was a stockbroker in Paris for a bit, and while he was doing that, he was also an amateur painter, and got to know and got linked with the Impressionists, and then of course he gives up the stock market and becomes a painter. This is his first trip to the tropics in 1887, when he went for a few months in the summer and autumn to the Caribbean island of Martinique. And I think you can see that he's sort of, you really sense that sort of warm, humid, a bit like the climate here, really. That there's sort of lush vegetation and those great towering tropical trees, very different from what he would be familiar with in Europe. And it's a mango grove, and the figures are really quite dwarfed by the scale of these magnificent trees. I'm sure you're familiar with Gauguin's later work that he does in Tahiti, and then at the end of his life in the Marquesas Islands, very often of Tahitian girls in sort of rich settings, with very flat kind of painting. He hasn't yet reached that style. This is still with the loose brushwork, the light, etc., is still very much in a sort of impressionist mode. Wonderful early watercolor by Van Gogh, when he's really sort of teaching himself to be an artist. He'd only really taken up art a couple of years before this, and he had very, very little formal training. In 1882, Impressionism back in Paris is fairly well developed, but Van Gogh is in The Hague in the Netherlands, and he's really virtually unaware of Impressionism at this time. Here he is looking out of a window, but he's not just looking through a window. He devised for himself a perspective frame, like an empty picture frame with strings drawn across it, so that he could hold that up in front of the view he's trying to depict and get the vanishing point and the line shooting off into the distance. A later work by Van Gogh, a very great painting, I think, from him as a mature artist, when he's now living in Arles in the south of France. This is painted in the summer. This is when he's waiting for the arrival of Gauguin, who will show up in the October of that year, and the two artists live together for about 3 months at the end of that year, ending rather disastrously when they have a huge fight and Van Gogh cut off part of his ear. But before then, he's painting very much, I think, anticipating Gauguin's arrival. He's trying to impress Gauguin with his own skill as an artist. And this really is an astonishing painting. It's a canal, and those little platforms down the right-hand edge are of washerwomen doing their laundry. But just the way he gets it to sort of, this is interesting seeing it, I think, just after that early work of the rooftops, because here he's also looking at perspective, but in a different kind of way. This just kind of shoots up the canvas with tremendous energy and force, this great sweep of the green bank on the left, the water just rushing up almost vertically. He was, like many artists, avant-garde artists at this time, very interested in Japanese prints with their kind of using perspective in a non-Western way, much sort of flatter way, and I think there's an influence there. In Van Gogh's mind, the south of France, Provence, became a kind of idealized version of his idea of Japan, which was a sort of idyll for him. But very, very forceful and strong brushwork. As Helga mentioned, I worked a number of years ago on an exhibition about Van Gogh and his letters, and he was one of the great artist letter writers of all time, and it's really interesting studying his letters because a very different view of him emerges, I think, from the sort of madman who threw paint at the canvas. He was highly educated, very well read, extremely thoughtful, quite philosophical man. And I think obviously this painting has, been painted rather quickly, otherwise he couldn't have captured that force and energy. But I think he thought a great deal about the paintings he made before he actually created them. I just show quickly here another work from the Beck collection here, from the same year. This is one of his great year of his career in many ways, the year at Arles in 1888, again, which has this sort of shooting up perspective. This is of a rocky outcrop just outside the town. Then we move on to a very different kind of artist. This is Paul Signac. He was a great yachtsman as well as a very distinguished artist. He sailed all around the ports of France. He even went as far as Istanbul. And here he is on his boat, and we're on it with him, looking over the stern of the ship. He's probably there with his easel, and he's capturing this sort of shimmering effect of light and sun on the River Seine in Paris, with two bridges going across in the distance, and to the right, a little steam train chugging across. And a lot of these artists were very interested in modern life, modern industrial, commercial life. They didn't turn their backs on it. On the contrary, they embraced it. And we often find factory chimneys or a train or something of that sort in the work of artists of this time. He's painting in a style that became known as Pointillism because it's little points of paint. It was these artists were interested in scientific color theory, the way that you could juxtapose different colors and get a very shimmering, brilliant effect. And the artist who really instigated this new style was Signac's friend, Georges Seurat. Unfortunately, he died very young, at the age of 32, but he had a great influence. And it was really this painting that put the style of Pointillism on the map. It's called Sunday Afternoon at La Grande Jatte. La Grande Jatte was a place a little bit like La Grenouillère that I showed you at the beginning of the lecture, a sort of leisure spot where people, Parisians, would go on a sunny Sunday afternoon. But you can see that the whole painting is composed of these little tiny points of color that sort of shimmer. And interestingly enough, when Van Gogh was leaving Paris, after he was in Holland, he lived in Paris for a couple of years, to get the train down to Arles, the last thing he did on leaving Paris was to go to the last exhibition of the Impressionists in 1886 to see this painting. And here is a painting here in your museum. I love this one. It's by Seurat, called La Poudreuse, the young woman powdering herself. And the whole canvas is just full of little spots of powder. And then back to Signac again, this time in Holland. And you can see his style is a little bit different. They're not such tiny dots. They're more like very small little dabs of very carefully controlled paint that build up this almost sort of mosaic effect. But it's very effective in creating these very subtle shifts of color. Then we move on rather violently to the early years of the 20th century, when another ism cropped up. Of course, none of the artists use these terms isms. They've just been invented by art historians as a kind of fairly useful roadmap. But it does have to be said, though, that this period that we're looking at and that's represented in this collection there's an amazing number of artistic revolutions that occurred in pretty rapid succession. Vlaminck, along with Derain and Matisse, was part of a group of artists that got nicknamed the Fauves, meaning wild animals, because when they exhibited at the Salon d'Automne in Paris in 1905, people were very shocked, not only by the violence and vividness of their color, but the violence of their technique. Here's a dancer at one of the Montmartre nightclubs, the Dead Rat, that artists used to frequent. And Vlaminck has got that very sort of white powder of her makeup and her chest, black stockings, her rather world-weary expression. But I think the most striking thing about this composition is the way it's made up of these brilliant sort of mass of cascading brushstrokes, which seem to absolutely absorb the figure. Another work on the left of 1905, the bridge at Chatou, one of these places, sort of now a suburb of Paris, but just out along the Seine, a perfect fauve painting again by Vlaminck, very interestingly, which compares so well with a painting of the same date here in the Beck collection at the Houston Museum. It's taken from a slightly different viewpoint, but I think you can see this sort of energy. Of course, he's looking at an artist like earlier work by Van Gogh, but they really did sort of push the boundaries. It's what had started with Impressionism as a new freedom of technique and color to new heights. And this is another tremendous work in your collection, The Turning Road by André Derain. I just show you this to give you a sense of the sort of pulsating hot color that these artists released. Now to something very different. So here we're looking at early Cubist paintings. The Roer is in the Houston collection. The Braque is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. we've really been looking, I think, with Fauvism at artists liberating colour. With Braque and Picasso, who really invented Cubism, they're looking very much more at form and space and the way and the relationship between form and space. And they analyze figures and try to sort of capture, try to fuse in the same composition a figure seen simultaneously from a number of different viewpoints. They're using very delicate sort of patch, little dabs of brushwork again. I mean, not in a way so dissimilar to the Fauves, but very, very much more muted and controlled. Neither of these works are in the exhibition, but the reason I'm showing them is they are a very important link with many of the works in the last gallery of the exhibition, the great works of the 20th century, including these two excellent paintings by Juan Gris, like Picasso, a Spaniard, friend of Picasso's, who absorbed a great deal from the lessons of that so-called high, very almost monochromatic cubism we were just looking at, often known as analytical cubism, because of the artists analyzing form and space. But from the beginning, Gris has a very original take on it. So he introduces a very lively little patch of color in this work on the left, the guitar, and a much more overall colorful scheme in the right. You can see how he's divided the composition into these sort of vertical strips almost, and we can make out the form of a guitar, but he's kind of deconstructed it in some way and made an echo of the shape on the left. He's also playing a lot with different textures here. You can see he's painting imitation wood graining, and he does that in the upper section on the right. And interestingly enough, Braque does that a great deal in his paintings because his father was actually a house painter and decorator. And wood graining was a sort of popular style for interior decorating at the time. And the Cubists, I think, really, particularly Braque and Gris, pick up on that in their compositions. This is a much later painting by Braque in the exhibition from 1943. You can see that he's still sort of choosing those rather familiar type of still life objects that the Cubists favored, and he's still playing a lot with texture and different colors, different textures, heightened by that startling yellow of the lemon that we see on its side and then front on as well. But it's very different feel from early Cubist painting. It's altogether a bit more opened up and a bit looser. Extraordinary painting by Fernand Léger of 1928, an enigmatic, strange painting, difficult to say what it's really about. There are two repeated profiles, one black and one white. The vertical object on the left is apparently an accordion. Is that right, Helga? I think so. And then he's got a draft board and a rather restrained but very unusual and very sophisticated palette. Just a few years before this, in around 1923-24, Léger had made a film called the Ballet Mécanique, the mechanical ballet, which is regarded as one of the great early avant-garde films, sort of Dadaist film, in which partly he celebrates the mechanization of modern life. And I think that in some ways this painting is about this, it's about the machine in a sense, although a machine is not represented. But the precision of it, the complete lack, the opposite of spontaneity, a highly sophisticated and very polished and very compelling painting. And I do encourage you, if in the gallery, to go up and take a close look at this work because it's absolutely meticulously painted. The brushworks are sort of invisible. He paints these absolutely, not exactly glossy, but they have a slight sheen to them, but very, very sort of smooth surfaces in this composition of these very cleverly overlapping and integrated shapes and forms. A much looser painting by Pierre Bonnard, who had been part of the so-called Nabi group of artists, along with Vuillard at the end of the 19th century. By this date, 1912, he's painting in a sort of a late impressionist, highly naturalistic style, a nice kind of model of someone's personal, probably the artist's personal possessions here, with the flowers placed in front of a checkerboard and the books and another painting behind. But quite a contrast to this beautiful still life by Matisse, admittedly painted, the Matisses are painted, 30-odd years later. But I think the approach is very different, because Matisse is so much about distilling the essence of something. I mean, this painting is all about harmony and balance. And he is, of course, one of the great colorists of the 20th century. So we get this marvelous sort of hot pink background with the fleur-de-lis pattern, probably a wallpaper. And then he just turns up the tension of the color a couple of notches. So you get a more sort of reddish pink in the bricks of what I think is a chimney piece. And then this white marble, the top of the chimney, on which it's like a sort of raft in a sea of pink, on which float this green Chinese, I think, pottery ginger jar, which actually crops up in quite a few of Matisse's still lifes. And then this group of 6 lemons. And you feel that one more lemon would have been one too many. It would have, it would have just kind of destroyed the sort of wonderful harmony and balance of this composition. But the total sort of stillness of it, in a way, is, I think, wonderfully broken up by these slightly wild green leaves that shoot out of the vase in the flower arrangement and seem to pick up the energy of the fleur-de-lis design of the background wallpaper. Now we end this marvelous collection with 3 outstanding works by Picasso, probably the most innovative artist of the 20th century, certainly the one who embraced and changed his style with more frequency than any other artist, at least I'm aware of. So we're very lucky to have 3 great portraits of 3 of the most important women in his life from different phases of his career. So the first one is this portrait of Olga Koklova, a very beautiful classical large drawing in charcoal on canvas. And I show you a photograph of her on the right. But this is Picasso in his sort of neoclassical phase of the early 1920s, where he has this incredible economy of line. There's no hesitation in that line whatsoever, the way he just brings this figure, her character, her bearing, her three-dimensionality to life with such astounding sureness. Olga Koklova was a Russian ballerina that whom Picasso met in 1917 when he was in Rome designing the sets for a ballet written by Jean Cocteau, the poet, called Parade, to be performed by the famous Russian dance company at the time, the Ballet Russe, who was led by Serge Diaghilev. Picasso was captivated immediately by Olga, by her beauty, by a sense of vulnerability that she exuded, and he married her in 1918. And then his life changed considerably, because having been a sort of bohemian, she was very bourgeois. They moved into a rather grand apartment just off the Champs-Élysées in Paris. And Picasso started having very expensive cars, wearing glamorous clothes, going to society parties. Olga kept the apartment immaculately, but Picasso was allowed to have his messy room, the studio. The relationship didn't actually last very long. It began to deteriorate quite quickly. Olga was quite sort of melancholy, apparently quite a difficult personality in some ways, although it should be said she had a very difficult life, because she came from a Russian family. Her father was an officer in the Russian army. She was born and grew up in St. Petersburg. She came to Paris to dance with the Ballet Russe. But then, of course, in 1917, the Russian Revolution broke out. Communism took over in Russia, and Olga was never able to go back to Russia and to see her parents or her family. And there are some very touching letters, you know, between her and her mother and her sisters and so on. But anyway, Picasso in the 1930s moved on to his next love, but Olga would never divorce him, and so they remained married until her death in 1955. The next, Picasso, woman seated in an armchair, a very different kind of painting, I think one full of a different kind of energy, full of violence and tension. The model here is Dora Maar, who was a very talented photographer associated with the Surrealist group. Picasso had a very tempestuous relationship with her, a lot of fighting, shouting and screaming. And I think some of that comes out in these sort of jagged forms of this painting. But it's an astonishingly powerful, when you walk into that gallery, it really sort of jumps right off the wall. He did a number of portraits using this very spiky armchair. And the palette here is extraordinary, this vivid green and this sort of blaze of orange against that yellow. Her breasts are hanging out, her face is kind of... There's a great deal, I think, behind this very magisterial and powerful painting, because only 4 years before this, in 1937, of course, is when Picasso painted his great painting, Guernica, which was inspired by the terrible bombing of the civilian population in the Basque town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War, which is a painting which is full of pain and anguish. And one of the most striking faces in it is the face of the weeping woman, which Picasso always associated with Dora Maar. And so here is Guernica. It's at the Reina Sofia in Madrid, and this is one of his many drawings and studies for the image of the weeping woman, a real expression of anguish. The last painting in the exhibition is a woman sitting in a Turkish costume. The muse here is his last companion and eventually wife, Jacqueline Roch. He met Jacqueline, I think, around 1951, and he married her in 1962, and she stayed with him until the end of his life in 1972. When they met, she was 27 and he was 70. And I think he had a very different kind of relationship with her. It wasn't as sort of as dramatic, let's say, as most of his previous relationships had been. There are a lot of very nice photographs like this one I show you on the right that suggest a real kind of companionship. He painted Jacqueline over 400 times and depicted her also, I mean, maybe not painted, but he depicted her in drawings, prints, and paintings numerous times. He was very struck by her rather classical Mediterranean looks. She was absolutely devoted to him. She worshipped him. He once said himself, "She turned me into a religion." And he was linked in her mind with his long-standing admiration for this great painting by Eugène Delacroix, one of the great artists of the first half, French artists of the first half of the 19th century, and his famous painting, The Women of Algiers in Their Apartment, which is in the Louvre in Paris. And I think you can see, you know, especially with the woman on the right, that kind of similarity between her profile and Jacqueline's. And this is a very special painting for the museum right now, because very recently it has acquired this wonderful painting on the right, which is an early version of, you know, part of the great Delacroix in the Louvre. So this is a fantastic addition to the French 19th century collections here. And this is sort of just jumping back a little bit to a painting you will have discovered earlier in this collection by Corot, and of the earlier generation than the Impressionists, but one whom they all admired very much. Again, showing this sort of sense of interest in women in Middle Eastern costume and this sort of colour, which is again something that, you know, again picking up on Delacroix as, oh dear, as the way that Picasso does in the in his painting of the girl in Turkish costume. he did a whole series of paintings looking at the Delacroix. I think he did 15 paintings altogether inspired by it, and I show you a different one here, as well as all these numerous drawings and prints. He either looks at the composition as a whole or at some of the details, and especially some of the drawings, the one I think at the upper right, have quite a lot of humor in them. Obviously, he's not really at all copying Delacroix. He's kind of trying to get at what the essence of the Delacroix is, his kind of color, the complexity of the composition, and the relationship of the figures to each other. So here's just a few of the works we've been looking at this evening. It's really a wonderful thing to have this collection here. It's full of really great masterpieces, most of which have not been seen in public before. And I think one of the really fascinating things I found, I can't say I really worked on this exhibition, I've just sort of come in late in the game, but just I think to see the relationships, that, rather unexpected relationships that come up between the different paintings. It makes you see things in a different way, because this is, after all, a private collection that's been put together with discernment and with passion by two individuals, a couple. So it's not saying that museum collections are not put together with passion, they certainly are, but it's a different sort of approach. And so it's really wonderful to have these pictures here, and they are, I think, exceptionally representative of this very dynamic and interesting period in the history of early modern art. So do enjoy them while they're here in Houston, because this is the only venue for this exhibition. Thank you for listening to me.